I'm Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture and Real Ag Radio, and joining me now is Dr. Ashleigh Weeden. She's a research associate with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, also doing her postdoc at Brandon University on with the Rural Development Institute, and considers herself a rural futurist, which I cannot wait to ask her about. Welcome here, Ashleigh.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, what is a rural futurist? I love that.
Yeah, well, I'll be perfectly honest, it started as slightly tongue-in-cheek, because the work that I was doing and have been doing for, most of the last 10 to 15 years has been focused on foresight, futurism, sort of how do we build the preferable futures that we want to see, not just sort of what we think could happen or is most likely to happen, but where do we want to go? So I work with leaders and organizations and communities across the country on developing those preferable futures in the past there. But I was always confronted with sort of the frustration that my wonderful pals in policy and planning seemed to think that the future was always in cities and that urbanists could only be the ones with the claim on the future. And so it kind of started as a slightly little bit of a tongue in cheek and see like there are futures in other places, and then became sort of a calling card. And that's really what the work that I do is. I primarily focus on what the future of rural looks like, not just sort of what might come at us, but how do we create and craft that future that we really want to see in rural places.
So, and to that end, and I love how you capture that because, some people might say, well, rural development is an oxymoron, right? If we want it to stay rural, why are we developing it? So, but development does happen in rural areas but it looks different. So from your perspective, we are talking, of course, in the context of an oncoming Ontario election at the end of February. You are based in Ontario, although, as you say, you work across Canada. But from that perspective, what has rural development in Ontario sort of looked like, let's say, in the last 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, and you're absolutely right that one of the main bugaboos that a lot of people have with rural policy and rural research and stuff is that certainly in the Western context that successful rural development policies and programs often seem to look like urbanization. There's this notion that rural places are cities in waiting or failed cities. And so most of I'm going to get real nerdy and technical here for a second, but most of the policies that we aim at rural places are aimed at creating something that we call agglomeration benefit. So the idea that happens in a lot of urban centers where you just have a lot more collisions because there's a lot more people there. So you have people kind of coming into each other and things happen because there's more density there, more people there. And so we aim these policies at places that are by their very nature low density and try to sort of create fake agglomeration benefits, try to create as if those things were there instead of saying, wait a minute, what if we actually looked at and treated rural places as places that have a right to exist in their own determination with their own goals and aspirations and what works in those communities rather than trying to superimpose urban policies in rural places or even policies from other rural places, like rural Saskatchewan and rural Newfoundland are incredibly different. And so what works in one place may not actually work at all or cause, harmful effects in another. And so I'm a much bigger fan and proponent in my work of what I call place-based policy, which is what happens if we look at sort of the unique overlying dynamics of physical geography, population demographic, socioeconomic things that are going on, history, relationships, interconnectedness to other places. And how then do we figure out what works in that place? And that helps get us out of this sort of often very unproductive urban rural, binary, this idea of it's us versus them, rather than saying like, hey, we're all these important nodes in the nervous system of the country. And we need all of these different places to function and work as best as they do at the apex of their existence rather than trying to be somewhere else. So all to say that I work towards a framework that I think is starting to pick up a little bit of attention and led by some colleagues out east at Karen Foster and sort of slightly north at Jennifer Jarman about the right to be rural. So what happens then if we change our notion of service delivery or policy development to from these very narrow categories of like, this is rural and this is urban to your postal code really shouldn't determine the quality of your life. And I think that's a far more appealing way to think about things rather than how do we shoehorn these places into something they just aren't, and instead create these vibrant, vital, and meaningful opportunities in the place as it is and as it wants to be.
And so now I mean, your focus is on the policies that sort of get us there, right? So what does that look like in planning? You mentioned sort of, focusing on what makes some place unique and what's unique to that area. So thinking about Ontario, I mean, we've got, significant pressure on housing, for sure. We've got, lots of population that spills out from the cities. What does, policy for rural development look like in Ontario that's unique perhaps to somewhere else?
Yeah, I think, it's a really interesting example, and I'm going to be maybe a little bit picky here on our friends at the OFA, that rural development really didn't make it into their list of priorities until I think 2016. And so we kind of have this interesting thing happening, I think, now where maybe industries and organizations that thought of themselves as sort of the voice of rural places, which may or may not be true. Like, actually, agriculture may or may not be the primary economic driver in a lot of rural regions. Often it's manufacturing or tourism and hospitality, and agriculture isn't in that prime place that it imagines it is sometimes, and sometimes it is. But what we've discovered is that often what's good for industry, and that's whatever industry you're talking about, whether that's manufacturing or agriculture as an industry, may not actually be all that good for the communities those people call home. So as we see things like increasing intensification of agriculture, so where you might have had 5 or 6 individual operations across a span of land, we now have a single landowner, or people that are buying up lots of lands and having larger operations. And then we have very small farms versus very large farms. Well, that may be good for the agricultural output. Is that good for the community if we have a structure where things like school funding is based on number of bums and seats, right? Or can you maintain a local grocery store with the number of people that are living there? So fewer people living and working on the land kind of has these knock-on effects elsewhere. But we get into this really unproductive, I think, debate between farming versus industry versus housing, right? Like that it has to be one or the other, and these are all mutually exclusive. And one of the things I like to work with, and this came out of discussions at the Rural Ontario Municipal Association a couple of weeks ago, was that it isn't either or. It's, are we making the best possible use of the resources that we have that leave the greatest number of opportunities open to us in the future and protect what we know we can't replace? And so one of these things, when we're looking at making these decisions over what we're going to allow or use for different rural land bases, is how are we making those decisions with our eyes wide open? And I think that's where we need to have greater transparency over the reasons for certain decisions, and to invite different voices into that process. For example, we're seeing some really interesting things happen around Northern Ontario, where communities that figure they can't find the land or the space to build affordable housing are finding private landowners or donating significant acreages to that, versus where we see, kind of in other parts where land is being expropriated in ways that we're not exactly sure for. And I think it all boils down to, we need to have a much clearer picture of the decisions we're making and why, so that one voice doesn't outweigh all the others and we can make really good community decisions. And that it isn't a case of sort of one thing or the other, because we can look at really great partnerships from different organizations, right? I think of like the Ducks Unlimited with the dairy farmers, and how they've managed to create these really great partnerships around stewardship of land on farms that may be better put into conservation and how to manage that versus into agricultural production. But they happen side by side, not as an either or thing. And I think we can think about the same things in terms of housing or other forms of development, that it doesn't have to be the image that people have in their mind that it's mutually exclusive, but that what doors are we opening and what doors are we closing as we make these policy decisions. And right now, I think we're making a lot of really reactionary policy decisions that are either don't build anything anywhere ever, or build everything all the time, pave over everything right now because we need to do things fast because we've missed the last 40 years of decision making, instead of being very thoughtful and purposeful about how we're going to make these decisions. Because as we all know, right, once prime agricultural soil has been built on, it takes 150 years to come back to that state. So it is farmland loss when we build over farmland, and we can't drink or eat concrete. So, if we're polluting water systems or we're not managing those appropriately or managing our land base appropriately, then we're going to be really in trouble. And so I think these conversations also happening in the context of what's happening south of the border, with us, I think you're having a lot more attention on these policy decisions of what we're doing with our natural resources and with our land.
hmm So I'm an action item kind of person. What do you hope we sort of see, regardless of throughout this election cycle, let's say, but certainly going forward in whoever may be premier after, or if it is the Ford government yet again, what do you hope happens policy wise? Once we head into March and into the year ahead.
I think I always have three key questions for people that are running for elected office or senior staff positions or any of those, which when we're talking about rural policy, which is, first, do we value rural places? And then I'm like you, action oriented, prove it, right? Like, so do we value rural places and how can you demonstrate that to me? And I would argue that in a lot of the decisions that we've been seeing made at the provincial level, federal level, all orders of government, that our understanding and a assessment of the way we value rural places is primarily around what can we take from, what can we exploit from them, what can we extract from them, or what do they do for other people, rather than what do they do for rural people and rural places themselves. So that's my first priority is like, how do you prove or how do you show that you value rural places in your decisions and investments? The second one is there such a thing? Do our people who are campaigning for office believe in the right to be rural? Is there a fundamental understanding that your postal code shouldn't determine whether you have access to a healthcare center, to education, to opportunities to build a meaningful life? That the fact that because you live rurally should not diminish your ability to access services and economic opportunity in our province and in our country. And again, as you said, prove it. So how can we see this in action through not just sort of the words of our leaders, but through what they decide through policy? And then the third one is, who has a seat at the table? So I'm always interested to find out who our provincial leaders or our federal leaders, particularly during an election campaign, who is it that they imagine when they think of people in rural communities? And I think it benefits us all when we take a very close look at that. It's sometimes nice to be thought of as the particular voice of rural or whatever. But if you look around a room and there's a lot of people that look and sound like you and not a lot of challengers, not a lot of different faces or different opinions, different industries represented, then we end up with poor policy decisions. So who gets to be represented and who gets to decide what happens next to these communities across rural Ontario is really important, particularly when we break it down to understanding that rural southwestern Ontario versus the near north versus northern and more remote Ontario all have very different experiences, needs, and priorities. And when we lump them all together and to sort of that rural, remote, and indigenous kind of line that comes out in a lot of policy statements, we miss the richness and the needs and the appropriateness of what we're doing in those communities. So my three questions is always, when we're developing a rural policy agenda for this election and the coming government is, do we value rural places? Is there a right to be rural? And who gets to decide what happens next?
All right. Dr. Ashleigh Weeden, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Lots of food for thought. Thank you. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.